coffee with Marc Lewon.
And here I am. Well,
Hello.
that was a bit of trouble
Hello,
there.
Marc.
Hello there.
Finally, we managed to connect. Right. Sorry for the delay. I'm sorry. These technical problems happen because yesterday we tried
Typical.
and it worked, but today it didn't work. So there's nothing we can do.
It's too weird.
Finally,
All the brilliant equipment that we have by now, and I see myself taping an iPhone to a music stand.
Okay. Sorry for that, but okay. Maybe some other day will work better. Anyway, for those of you who are watching now, or those of you who will watch this video in the future, today we're having a coffee with a great musician specialized in early music, especially Middle Ages music. And his name is Marc Lewon. He's the director of the early music ensemble Leoness. And as you know, those of you who follow this series of A Coffee With, we will get to know the person behind the musician, and in this case also the musicologist. Hello, Marc.
Hello, Michael.
So nice. I'm really happy to have you here. Yeah, I have my coffee here as well. So
good. Cheers.
Right. Let's start by the beginning. You are German. You've been born in 1972, so we are the same year. I was born in 1972 as well.
It's a good year.
Yeah, the best year, I think. And you were born in Frankfurt. And then at a certain point in your life, I don't know when exactly, you decided or you started playing music. When was that?
Okay. I don't really know. I got that into that system that you have in Germany, which is called musikalische Früherziehung, where you start with a xylophone, and of course with a recorder. What else? Yeah. Sorry to all the recorder players out there that I massacred this instrument as well when I was little. Yeah. So, but I then at some point discovered the guitar. I think when did I start? It was about 5 or so with some lessons. And I discovered the guitar at some point, and then had private lessons in guitar. That was basically my musical beginning, and fairly humble, I must say. It's not very spectacular.
Are there any musicians in your family?
No. I'm actually the only one, I think, in the whole wide family, which is not so wide, but yeah. I'm the odd case out. There are no other musicians in my family that I know of. Apparently, my grandfather, who died in the 40s, apparently he could play several instruments, but we've never met, of course. Yeah.
Right. So then you started learning how to play the guitar, and when did you get that feeling for early music? Was an early thing in your life, or was it a late thing?
Not really. It took a while for me to find my musical taste, really. And of course, I listened to the radio as anyone did in the 80s, and popular music and that. And then I listened to some of the LPs with classical music that my parents had. But I think one thing that maybe pushed me towards earlier music was when, with my father, we listened to a German folk group, a German folk band on the car radio, and he was so fascinated by that he ordered the LP via the local bookshop back then, and we listened to that LP in and out, and that folk group also played some earlier tunes, some Renaissance melodies, but of course with folk instruments. They were called Elster Silberflug, in case you're interested.
Elster Silberflug, okay.
Yeah. And that followed me around for a while, and that way I believe I kind of developed a bit of a taste for this other kind of music, the earlier, something that's different. Yeah.
Right. Then you, at a certain point as well, you decide to listen to study music, because you are not only a musician, you are also a musicologist, and you also studied early German language, so to say. You're specialist in German, right?
Well, I did study it, yeah, and as far as that goes, I might be something of a specialist, but you know, I didn't follow it through after the master's studies. So I did musicology and German, medieval German, as my second study in Heidelberg, and I studied for a master's degree, Magister Artium back then. And after that, I then continued to go to the Schola Cantorum to study the lute there.
Let's just study the lute. Okay, what led you from guitar, which is something, especially when you're young, when you are in your teens, playing the guitar is like a bit cool, you know. But what led you from the guitar to the lute and the lute family instruments?
I don't think I was very cool with the guitar, actually. I was a bit more nerdy, like. Yeah, but the guitar, when I played the classical guitar repertoire, there were also books with arrangements of earlier pieces. There were some Renaissance pieces in there. I did not know that at the time, but I really liked those pieces. So I played them a lot. I memorized them all. And I think that might have also helped. At some point, I met someone who, when I played the arrangements of Dowland pieces on the guitar, said, you should play the lute. That would be the proper instrument. You know, remember, I say back then, you know it also. I mean, it's not that, it doesn't feel that far back, but we're talking about the 80s, late 80s. And of course, you couldn't Google anything. No? It's not like you can look it up very easily somewhere, what you're supposed to do with this. So I didn't have any kind of background foil to understand the music better. I just played the stuff, and then someone said, actually, that's supposed to be for the lute, and you should play lute. And then I went like, wait a minute, okay, that's interesting. So how does a lute work? Where could I get something like that? So I called around a bit, found someone in Heidelberg who would tell me a bit more about it, would explain to me how tablature works. I went there, bought a lute and got some explanations, and then practiced for myself, and then started doing lute.
Right, and that was in Schola Cantorum Basiliensis.
No, that was way before. That was still in the 90s in Heidelberg.
In Heidelberg.
I did the lute on the side, basically, and on the side with musicology.
But then you specialized in lute in Schola Cantorum.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And from that, you also went to Oxford University?
Okay, that was quite a bit later. So after I'd finished my studies at the Schola, I did lute as a main subject and then fiddle as a minor subject there. After that, I continued playing, performing and recording, founded the Ensemble. And at some point I thought, if I want to go any further with the musicology thing that I had done before, if I want to put another layer on top of that, I should do it now. That was in 2010 or 11, I believe. And that was the point where I thought, okay, if I want to do something more like that, I'd like to have a new experience too. And that was the idea, because I had a friend who had studied in Oxford, and he said, yeah, Oxford's cool, I should try that. And so I applied for that, it worked, so I did it there. So that was after we had already started with Leonis.
Okay.
So I did it on the side as well.
Yeah, since you know both systems, I mean the German educational system, and you've been in Oxford, so you know also the British way. What did you learn in the United Kingdom that you couldn't learn in Germany?
Okay, well, when you read for a PhD, then you're pretty much on your own. I mean, you've got your supervisor, and that's the most important person. And I was interested in this particular supervisor, Reinhard Strom. He is this all-knowing late medieval genius, basically. And I thought that's the person to go to. That's the go-to person, and that really triggered also my interest to study in Oxford, because he was there. And yeah, when you read for a PhD, you don't need to do much more than actually read, study for yourself, do research and write and be in touch with your supervisor. So you're not so much dependent on other classes that happen. So I attended a few classes also in Oxford, and of course they have great research opportunities and possibilities with a Bodleian library and all that. That's all good, but a lot of it you can also access online. And my main interest was the people to meet there, that is Reinhard Strom and others. There's also Elizabeth Eva Leach, who was my college supervisor, St. Hugh's College, and other great scholars who live and work in Oxford. I mean, meeting them there, that was particularly special for me. I didn't have any taught classes. That made it very different from my first studies in Heidelberg, where I attended lectures and had classes and all that, the proper study stuff.
So you have a PhD in philosophy of music.
That's right.
What was your thesis about?
It's called Transformational Practices in 15th Century German Music, I believe.
Okay.
Actually, I would have to look it up, I have it here.
So
yeah,
what was it exactly about? What was it about for those people who who are not specialists?
It sounds very specialized, doesn't it? Well, 15th century German music can be somewhat elusive, and I've focused it on case studies. There's the famous Glogawa Leaderbook. Many people might have heard that title, and it is a very interesting collection of music, and I use that as a central case study to then develop what I wanted to talk about. And transformational practices means how music gets reworked in that time, and how we can see that in the manuscript music, so that vocal music becomes or is rearranged to become instrumental music, or even the other way around, that instrumental music gets reworked, reused, and be made into vocal music instruments. And I was the aim of my dissertation was to show different ways of how things were reworked into other things, musically speaking. Sometimes also depending, also working with the texts. So with the song texts, we are talking about contrafactures. So writing new texts to known music and all that. So in several chapters, I've tackled different aspects of this transformational processes, how music gets reworked, essentially.
You've just mentioned das Glogawa Leaderbook, and you have a CD on Naxos about this. We will come back to this CD, das Glogawa Leaderbook, but I want to go back in time. When did you decide to go professional?
Okay, that was, I would say 94, possibly 1994, 95, about that time. When I was studying musicology in Heidelberg, I needed money. So what do you do when you're an aspiring musician and musicologist and need money? You try to get gigs to earn money that way. And the way to do that back then, the way for me was actually the medieval markets, you won't believe. So I founded a group back then who went on medieval markets and played medieval and Renaissance music in a kind of popular street music fashion. So we got gigs on medieval markets and banquets, medieval banquets, and we played the bawdy stuff, but also some kind of romantic sounding pieces, and sort of earn my living there, earn my keep via that. And that was kind of a tiptoeing into the professional life as a musician. Of course, you learn lots of other crafts when you're playing street music, trying to keep an audience and being approachable and making lots of noise, and all that was very helpful later when you go on stage,
And when did you see that you could make a living on early music, medieval actually?
Yeah, I was always interested in going earlier. So I started with a Dowland, with Renaissance music, and then tiptoed my way into the earlier repertoires. And I must say, I said that also in another interview, I believe, that in the very beginning, when I first actually listened to medieval music recordings, real medieval music recordings, that I wasn't always super convinced, that I didn't really, like it immediately. It wasn't like, oh, that's what Minnesang sounds like. Brilliant. I love it. I only want to do that. It wasn't really like that. It was an acquired taste. It took time to understand the music more. And the more I did it and the more I understood about it, the more I liked it. The more I started to like it, really. So a long path into medieval music, and then I never wanted to turn back, and I felt, okay, I want to continue this way. I want to earn my living playing music. And medieval music was the way forward for me.
Yeah. So then you decide to play medieval music, but you also have to find musicians who know how to play medieval music. Was it easy to find those people who could join you?
For the market music that we did, we found each other, with a common interest in kind of an alternative musical style, who had an interest in early music somehow, and who were also touring the medieval market. So that was a fairly easy way in, because of some context, you just find each other and then you go ahead. But if you want to go further, if you want to really go pure about it, if you want to study it and understand it to a very high degree, then you need to go where there are people who also understand it. And for me, that was the Schola Cantorum. When I arrived there, I had the feeling, finally, here are the people who know about it. I mean, the teachers who really know their stuff, and in and out, and all the questions that I had, I could get answered here. Remember, again, this is before you could just find it on the internet if you search for stuff properly. Yeah. So some things that I could find out now, probably, with a dedicated couple of hours of research on the internet. Back then, it took me basically years to figure out for myself, through classes or through meeting some people or through reading something and trying to figure it out for yourself. It's much easier now. But it was the Schola Cantorum that really made that happen for me. And I found the people there with whom I still play, which is brilliant.
Right. So for those people who usually don't listen to early music or medieval music, what could you tell them to approach that repertoire, which is not so common, actually?
I think what you have to do is you have to listen to quite a bit. I understand. There could always be one recording or a concert that really triggers something within you, because usually I think how it works is you associate something that you already know. So you're listening to something and you recognize something you already know and like. And that often is the way in. So it was for me. I listened to some things that I liked. Later, it turned out, actually, that was not historically informed, the thing that I liked. But it kind of took me another path. It took me another way. And then, let yourself be taken somewhere else. That's basically the acquired taste. It requires that you have to find a way in somehow, something that you like or recognize, but then it will probably lead you somewhere else, and let yourself be led that other way, and then you'll discover something.
You've just said something that I find very interesting. You said the music you listened to in the past maybe was not musically informed.
Historically informed. Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
so,
they were all musical.
No. I said it was my mistake. Yeah. Historically informed, and so do we know how people played music in the 13th 14th, 15th century?
We know some things.
How do we know we are historically informed?
Okay. That's a huge subject now. Only thing that I want to say at this point is, of course, we can never say exactly how it was done. Yeah? We have here and there some good ideas or quite good ideas in which direction it would have gone, or especially then in the Renaissance, we have some more information, some clearer information for instrumentations or what people did or where and when they performed, all that. But there is a lot more than you might think. There is a big gray area, of course, of possible performance practices. And it is even possible that something was done in very different ways in the Middle Ages. So that if we are confronted with one piece, we cannot say it was done, one particular way. We know that, but we don't exactly know how this way, what this way was. We can expect that a piece might have been performed quite differently by different people in different contexts in the Middle Ages. So even there might be a gray zone of right, correct solutions. Yeah, but the gray zone is actually has certain boundaries. There are certain things we can say they didn't do. So even though there are a number of possible solutions that we would consider historically informed, there is a whole range of possibilities that clearly are not, and that we can also say. So there's also an argument ex negativo there, if you want to be historically informed. Musical, anything can be musical, yeah. But if we want to be historically informed, if we're trying to recreate to some degree the sound of a forgotten time, of a long bygone time, then there are indeed certain boundaries, that we can define.
So we are speaking about early music, and early music requires early instruments. In this case, the lute. So if you have any instruments at hand, could you speak about the lute? And for those who don't know about the lute, just basically, not very profoundly, briefly, explain how it works and
I can
what it is like.
just pull one out of a case here, just so you can see it. Okay, here we have one. You can see it's quite worn already. Yeah, I'm playing with a plectrum. This is for me, this is a plectrum instrument. If you want to see the whole thing, a bit like this. You can see the pear-shaped, kind of oval body, a relatively short neck, a sharp angled head. As you can see, it's almost 90 degrees. And the back is a beautifully formed bowl, roundish, made up of ribs, different ribs of wood that are glued together. You can see there are two sound holes, and they have beautiful rosettes. This one is even tiered. It has several layers, as you can see, ornamented layers. And the other one has a little Gothic window. Very cute. This instrument, and you can see the frets are bound. They are actually made of gut, and they are bound around the neck. This is a typical lute of the late 15th century. So we're talking about 1470s to 1500, early 16th century. A lute or on the verge from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It's basically an early Renaissance lute, but in the 15th century it was still played with a plectrum. So with a plectrum, not with the fingers. Not with the fingers. In the right hand. The left hand is of course fretting, but the right hand uses a plectrum to pluck the strings. There is some circumstantial evidence that maybe a finger was also additionally used occasionally in the late 15th century. Obviously, they already played polyphony solistically on the instrument, sometimes still using a plectrum and then bit by bit changing to pure finger playing. So by 1500, most lutes would have been probably played with the fingers, but only a generation before, plectrum playing was the standard still. So we are in a changeover time, very interesting time between plectrum playing and finger playing.
So now let's go now to this music book you mentioned before, das Glogawa Leaderbook, the songbook. There is a CD of yours on Naxos, 2008. and that is entitled the same, I mean, Das Glogawa Leaderbook, which is German, early German songs. So what can you tell people about that collection of songs and music?
Okay, yeah, it was one fairly small source. It doesn't look that big. It's amazing that you can pull an entire dissertation out of that. And not only that, there have been other big publications only on that one songbook. It contains a huge amount of information if you dig in. It's a very diverse source. It's a collection, probably privately owned, that was someone who was learned in the time and maybe as a student, probably as a student, we don't exactly know, collected songs. And the interesting thing is that the songs that are written down there with music and text appear in very different forms. Most of them are monophonic. So you'd think, okay, this is just a melody and a text, that's it. But the notation indicates that it may have been part of a polyphonic ensemble, and that this person who wrote it down wrote only his voice, the main voice, the tenor voice. So that's the voice that also carries the text in German songs of the time. So that he might have had a Partbook, and other people might have had the other parts, so that when they come together, they make polyphonic music rather than monophonic music. Then there are a few pieces that are also notated polyphonically, so with several voices, 2 or 3 voices in that songbook. And they seem to come from a different place, you know, might have been notated for different reasons polyphonically. And then attached to the back is also a tablature source for the keyboard. So here we have an instrumental source bound together in the same book. This was for an organ, probably. And most of the intabulations, most of those organ pieces in the back are actually instrumental reworkings of songs that you'll also find in the first part. So polyphonic intabulations of songs. So, and if you look at the relationship between all these pieces, you can uncover an entire network of practices. How did people make music in that time, in that area? With what instruments, what methods did they use? And this is not only professionalists, this is not only professional musicians, but also rich citizens of the towns, of the cities. This songbook was probably written in Nuremberg. So we are, and we even have dates. So it's the 1450s, we have a date, we have a place, we have a repertoire. That makes it very interesting, and you can branch out from that and make connection to other sources that you will find in that time around. And thus you can create an entire network of interrelationships. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. So that CD was the first one you recorded with Ensemble Lyonnais, I think?
Not quite. This was an ensemble that I had before with 2 other colleagues from the Schola Cantorum. It was called Dulce Melos. And we made 2 CDs, the Glogawa Leaderbook and then later the Glogawa Leaderbook. Exactly, yeah.
I'd like to talk about that CD too, because I've listened to it many, many times. So I know that CD quite well. That's Glogawa Leaderbook. And I have to say, when I first knew about it, it drew my attention because of the drawing of this. It's also on the CD, but there's a drawing that I said, okay, I like this drawing. And that made me get into the music. So, and
you mean the cover picture, or?
Yeah, the cover picture, yes.
Okay, that cover picture actually does not have a direct relation to the repertoire, but the collection was done by an abbot, and we have a later depiction of said abbot, and it looked a bit like this picture from the 15th century that I found. So I kind of associated that picture with the songbook, even though it does not have a direct relation to the source.
And I have to say the music is great. For those of you who haven't listened to any medieval music, especially German, coming from the German tradition, it's a really interesting set of songs. What can you tell us about this music?
Yeah, it is a very interesting collection. And in fact, my next ensemble class in the Schola Cantorum will be about the Glogawa Leaderbook. Some by now call it not the Glogawa Leaderbook, but the Sagan Partbooks, because Glogawa Liederbuch or Glogawa Songbook is somewhat misleading. That was the term for this source when it was first discussed in musicology, the earlier 20th century. It was then called the Glogawa Liederbuch because it was assumed that it was from the monastery of Glogau, which is now in Poland. And in fact, it was collected in a nearby monastery in Sagan, so different monastery. It is, in fact, the first collection, the first songbook in Partbooks. So it's not one source, but it's actually 3 books. One book for each voice. And this is the first one that we know. In the Renaissance, this will become a standard method of printing polyphonic music, that you print part books. So each musician can have their own voice. So you have a set of books. I even have some back here. I can pull one up if you want to see it.
Yes, I'd love to.
One sec. What have I here? Okay, this is Heinrich Isaac, Constantinus, Choralis Constantinus. And here we have the part book. So this is a set.
Yes.
And we have 4 part books, and each part book is dedicated to one voice. So we have one discantus for the highest voice, and the altus, the contratenor altus, the high contratenor for the second, the tenor for the lower voice, and the contratenor bassus for the lowest voice. So each musician just takes one book, and they then agree which piece they choose from, and then they have only their voice in front of them. Very efficient that way, and very practical for making music basically at home, just for your own enjoyment and entertainment. And the Glogawa Liederbuch, the Glogawa Songbook, was probably used in this way. The Glogawa Songbook is in fact a handwritten source. So that it's a manuscript, while these later ones are all printed. These were all printed. But the Glogawa Songbook is the first one in part books. So it's actually 3 books.
Right. And then that CD was recorded or released in 2012. And then there is another CD that I would like, of yours, that I'd like to mention, because I love this, can I say composer? I'm talking about Oswald von Wolkenstein. Was he a composer? What would you say?
There's actually articles dedicated to just this question. How far could Oswald compose himself? It's very hard to answer, because most of the polyphonic pieces that survive by him are in fact contrafactors. So he used a composition that was already there, and he made a new text to it. And he doesn't talk about composing himself. And of course, in that time, a composer might even not refer to himself as a composer, but as a singer or a performer or someone who makes music. And I would, however, I would suggest that he, in the modern sense, composed a lot of his songs, particularly the monophonic songs, but there's also a repertoire of non-mensural polyphony. It's a very technical term again. So a particular repertoire of polyphonic, actually 2-voice pieces that sound archaic, with parallel fifths and stuff. So it sounds a bit improvised and archaic to us, but this is actually a practice of making polyphony on the spot, improvising it, if you will. And apparently he had mastered, or he knew that technique, and some of his pieces that sound like that are probably by himself.
Right, because the CD I'm referring to is the Cosmopolitan from 2014. Also great music, but I'm fascinated about the life of Oswald von Wolkenstein. He had a very interesting life for the time because he traveled a lot. He wrote music. He did a lot of things, and for sure we know very little about his life.
We actually of his life. I can just scan a bit around here. Can you see the kind of the next to the yellow thing? You can see these kind of red books.
Yes,
5 of them. That's a complete edition of all documents that relate to Oswald von Wolkenstein. That's over 1,000 documents that survive.
Wow.
Yeah. So we actually know about him quite a bit. A lot more than of any other musician of the time, probably. Of course, we do not know certain details of personal life. These documents usually are legal documents. We know when he was where, or where he signed a treatise or something like that, because he was also a politician. But we actually are fairly well informed about Oswald, better than about most people from the 15th century.
Generally speaking, what could you tell about the music of Wolkenstein?
Well, it's we have about 120 songs, give or take. It's a bit difficult to define exactly because there are some pieces that are also ascribed to him, and it's not entirely sure. But about 120 songs. Some of them are multiple texted songs. So he took one melody and wrote 6 different songs on it, song texts to it. So we have, I would say, about 60 monophonic melodies, songs by him, and about 40 polyphonic songs. They're usually divided thus, are they monophonic or polyphonic? That division is actually not quite so good anymore. So we know that a lot of the techniques he's using for the polyphonic music, you could also extemporize them on other monophonic pieces, and then they would also be polyphonic. So it's more a practice of how to do the music rather than a compositorial technique. People very often just very certain monophonic songs which have been done in the past and which people like and then redo. And this is the old school of recordings generate recordings. So you've got who in the 70s makes a good recording, and then people repeat those songs all the time, even though there are all these other songs that then know what he does. So I think our picture of Oswald's music is very much defined by the recordings, and especially by the early recordings, which defined what Oswald is and how you should conceive Oswald. But I think there are so many sides to this personality and also to his poetry and music that there is space to discover more facets. And I believe that a picture of the kind of the ruffian, the raw, it falls short of what he actually. Of course, they're a bit more crude or kind of funny and simple, but there are also those which are highly complicated and which require a singer, a performer who can, sing low and high. You need a range of almost 2 octaves for some of the pieces. If you want to do them properly, you need to be highly trained to do that well. It's very difficult. Some of them are very difficult. Others are very easy. So it's a huge mixed bag. And in the past, the focus has been more on the popular or the easier to listen to pieces. Yeah. There's more to develop and to understand about Oswald. So
good. So that CD was from 2014. It's impossible to talk about all your CDs because you have over 50 CDs with different ensembles. So, but there's one I'd like to mention, and it's one that I haven't listened to. This year's CD 2020, and it's entitled "The Two Lutes with Grace." Can you speak about this music?
Okay, this is inspired by my own teacher and the teacher of my colleague, Paul Kiefer, who played with me on the CD. Our teacher, Crawford Young, at the Schola Cantorum, brought us in touch with this repertoire, really, and showed us how important the lute duo was in the 15th century. It's one of those combinations of instruments about which we know a lot. So there were these professional instrumental ensembles in the 15th century who would tour the courts, who would go from court to court, play there, and they would perform with two instruments from the lute family, possibly a larger lute and a smaller lute, or a lute and a gittern, which is again a smaller lute-like instrument. And they would play with plectrums, and they would play diminutions upon known tenors, about known melodies. So one would play the known melody and the other one would play a virtuosic ornamented upper voice to it. So we know about these professional ensembles, but their music doesn't survive. That's so problematic. So what they did, they probably memorized all their repertoire and also extemporized, improvised new diminutions. So music on the spot. Music as a process rather than a composed artifact. And so we know of them, but we do not have exactly what they did. But we know what kind of pieces they would play or perform or use as their basis for their improvisations. And so what we did here was we wanted to recreate that ensemble combination of the 15th century. And we took repertoires from manuscripts around 1500 and some prints just after 1500, which appear to give us a glimpse of that practice, because there are some instrumental pieces in these sources which are not assigned to any instruments. So we do not know who played them, but the way they look on the parchment or on the paper is that they could plausibly have been repertoire that these lutenists would have played. So we used actual lute duos from the earliest lute prints, which seemed to shadow a technique that the lutenists of the 15th century used for plectrum lutes, and then complemented that with other two-voice pieces from these manuscripts, to recreate a practice, basically.
Yeah, right. It's just instrumental.
The music that we are playing with the two lutes is just instrumental, but they are usually reworkings of vocal pieces. So for a few of these pieces, for these reconstructions, we played together with a singer, Grace Newcomb, who would then sing the chanson on which then other instrumental reworkings were based, so that you first hear the song and then you hear the instrumental diminutions and reworkings of those songs.
I understand. There is another CD that I'd like to talk about, and this one I haven't listened to yet either, because of the composer, which is Wislas von Druigen, and it's a CD you've recorded with Ensemble Peregrine.
Okay, here we're going into a very, very different realm. We're going into the 13th century, and we are talking about a Minnesinger who survives only in one source, which is the Jena Liederhandschrift, the Jena Songbook. It's an early 14th century source with German Sangspruchdichtung, Spruchsang, and Minnesang. And the works of Witzlaw are there in that source. We don't exactly know if he was actually a Witzlaw von Rügen. His name is Witzlaw in the source, and he was associated with some von Rügen family, but maybe he was not. Maybe he was just a professional Minnesinger. And his works are very, very nice, very beautiful melodies, and never recorded in full. It was now Agnieszka Budzinska-Bennett, Ensemble Peregrine, undertook a complete recording of all the surviving songs, and I played a larger role in there because I also made transcriptions and some reconstructions of missing lines. Some are incomplete, and you need to compose a line of music or text to complete them. and performed in that. And that was a great pleasure. And I'm looking forward. I haven't yet seen it, so I'm looking forward to this one.
What are you up to in the next project, or what would you like to do in the future?
Currently, we are concentrating a bit on our series Rev Renaissance, which we just installed in Basel. It's a series for Renaissance music, one concert of Renaissance music every month, every last Sunday of the month, in the big central church, the Barfüßerkirche in Basel. And we've just started. We wanted to start in March, but due to Corona, we had to postpone, we had to reschedule. But since we were planning one concert each month, that gave us the opportunity, as soon as with certain distancing rules and safety measures, it was allowed again to do concerts, we could just jump in again and start in June, actually. So that's the first concert we did, and which I directed on the Kettenacker Liederbuch. And just 2 days ago, we did the second one on the Löwen Chansonnier, a newly found source of Burgundian chansons. We did that also, and I directed that one. The next one is not directed by myself. That will be an alta cappella playing. It's going to be very interesting. And then in September, I'm back and in doing one with my former teacher, Crawford Young, actually. We are playing in September. So this is where I'm currently focused on, because that includes a lot of organization and planning and preparing the music and the programs. It's challenging, but very nice to actually do something right now.
So, as you know, there are 3 sections that are fixed in this series of I Got a Wish, and one of them is on books. And the question is, what kind of books do you read, and if you have any books to recommend?
Okay, books. It depends a bit if you're thinking about whatever I read, or something to recommend that is from the field, from the field of early music or so. If you're thinking of the popular reading, I tend to get good recommendations by a friend, and they are always a winner. And I particularly like good science fiction. And Neil Stevenson is one of the authors that I enjoyed there. Anathema is a book that I would really recommend. I enjoyed that one. And other popular reading that I sometimes do in between includes the Terry Pratchett Discworld novels and Game of Thrones. I read all those. That kind of stuff, bit of fantasy and science fiction, that's quite nice. But if you're thinking about literature that refers to early music, there is one book that I had actually recommended before, which is The Idea of Music by Herbert M. Schuler. I don't exactly know how, this is a German name, but in America, I don't exactly know how to pronounce it. Very interesting guide through how the late antiquity thought about music until the high Middle Ages, how thinking about music developed over the ages. It's a very comprehensive, good read.
The idea?
The Idea of Music.
The Idea of Music. Good.
Yeah, it's a very good one.
You read books, and I can tell you've read a lot of books, because behind you have a whole collection of books.
A lot of them are also editions, and I haven't actually read through all of them. A lot of them are also references.
But anyway, I love that when people have so many books, because I love books. And next section is about recordings. If you have any recordings you think are worth listening at least once in a lifetime.
Okay, there could be some standard answers regarding recordings that I used to like, but I won't talk about Beatles or anything like that. But I think more interesting might be the music that brought me into medieval music, or that inspired me as an early musician. And I would really recommend a CD or an album that my former teacher, Crawford Young, recorded. It was a solo album. I mean, he had some supporting artists on that one, but it was kind of his solo album called Intabulations.
Intabulations.
Intabulations. The thing is, this is basically impossible to find anymore. It's, as far as I know, it's out of print. And I only have a copy, and I have it. I recommend it regularly, and I hope it will be republished at some point. But that is I found that very inspiring to see what you can do with a plectrum lute, also soloistically. Very virtuosic, very sensual playing. And that was very inspirational. I listened to that just before I came to the Schola, and that got me into, touch with that performer and teacher.
Yeah.
Another one could be Triste Plaisir by Lena Suzanne Norin with Randall Cook and Susanne Ansorg. This is about Burgundian chansons, and I think they've really captured the essence of what a Burgundian chanson is of the 15th century. I found that very inspiring. And now coming to think of it, there's another one that I would recommend. That's John Flagle's solo CD, World is Bliss. And that is an album. John Flagle sadly died. He was a singer also with Crawford Young's ensemble in the 90s. And he had this solo project where he accompanied himself on the harp and a bit on the lute and on the fiddle, and played mainly English medieval songs, some of which he had composed a melody for. So some of the melodies are his own. But there's also a folk-like atmosphere that pervades this album, but I found that highly inspiring. So these are some that I really enjoy. Yeah.
And now we come to the last part of our coffee, which is in case someone in 100 years, none of us would be here. In theory, maybe, who knows? But I don't think.
Very likely, so. Yeah.
Very likely. If someone in 100 years would watch this video, would watch you, Marc Lewon, what message would you like to leave for that person?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's very hard. When people make predictions into the future, they tend to be always wrong. Or hilariously wrong. So it is very hard to send a message into a time that you might predict very wrongly. So what I would do is I would think back 100 years and see what people back. I would stay within the realm of my expertise. So performance of early music, or thinking about music of times long gone by. And I would think back maybe 100 years, see what people of the early 20th century or even the 19th century have done with early music, with medieval music, and how we now think about that and what they tell us. And sometimes I think, sometimes when we look at what former scholars have done in editing or talking about medieval music, and particularly about performance of early music, sometimes we tend to smile a bit and belittle it a bit because we know so much more now. I think often enough we do them wrong, and I have read some things even from the 19th century where I thought, man, they were so far advanced in thinking about this music. Respect. And I would humbly ask, if I go now 100 years forward, I would humbly ask the future generations to view our efforts benignly and with a grain of salt. Yeah? We also try to make a living, and sometimes things that come across as factual, or we believe it must have been like that. In 100 years, there will be other ideas around, and we've been told this by experience, that we won't stay being right now, and but that there may still be some things that we did now, that we're doing now, that may have some worth even in 100 years' time.
Good. So, Marc, thank you very much for joining us in this series of A Coffee With. It was a pleasure. Of course, there are always lots of things I'd like to speak about with you, but
Of course.
time is up, and that's life. That's how life works. So,
Cheers, mate.
yeah. Cheers. Thank you very much.
Cold now.
Yeah,
Okay.
cool. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Michael.